On May 8th, 2026, Sony Interactive Entertainment released their fiscal year earnings report. Buried in the financial documents was a single line that sent shockwaves through the gaming industry. Sony had recorded a $765 million impairment loss against the assets of Bungie, the studio they had purchased for $3.6 billion just 4 years earlier. In financial terms, an impairment loss is what you record on your books when an asset is worth dramatically less than what you paid for it. It's an accounting admission that you overpaid, that the future earnings you expected aren't coming, that the bet didn't work. Sony had paid $3.6 billion for Bungie in 2022. By May 2026, they had written down the value of that purchase by $765 million. And, according to industry analysts, more write-downs may be coming. The studio behind that write-down has a name that any gamer over the age of 25 knows by heart: Bungie. The studio that built Halo. The studio that defined the original Xbox. The studio that created Destiny and shaped an entire genre of looter shooters. The studio whose games have sold hundreds of millions of copies, generated billions of dollars in revenue, and produced some of the most iconic moments in gaming history. How did this studio, once considered untouchable, end up as the worst acquisition in PlayStation's history? The answer is a story spanning 35 years, 3 corporate parents, 2 divorces, multiple near bankruptcies, and a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. Bungie is the studio that can't stop running. Every time they escape one corporate parent, they end up in the arms of another. Every time they sign a deal promising autonomy, that autonomy gets stripped away. Every time they reach the top of the industry, something catastrophic happens to bring them back to the brink. This is the story of how Bungie became one of the most important game studios in history, how they built and lost and built and lost again, how they're now facing the worst crisis of their existence, and how, despite everything, despite the layoffs, despite the failed launches, despite Sony writing down their value by $750 million, Bungie has one card left to play. This is the story of Bungie, the studio that can't stop running and can't stop getting caught. Before Halo, before Destiny, before any of the wars and acquisitions that would define the company, Bungie was 2 guys in Chicago. Alex Seropian and Jason Jones founded Bungie in 1991 while Jones was still a student at the University of Chicago. Their first game, Operation Desert Storm, sold 2,500 copies. Their second game, Minotaur, The Labyrinths of Crete, sold 2,500 copies. They were not, by any measure, succeeding. But they were learning, and they were Mac developers in an era when Mac gaming was a wasteland, which meant the few games that did exist on the platform had no competition. In 1993, they released Pathways into Darkness, a first-person dungeon crawler that became one of the most important Mac games of the early 90s. In 1994, they released Marathon, a first-person shooter on the Mac that competed with ID Software's Doom by adding things Doom didn't have: a coherent story, environmental puzzles, multiplayer over local networks. Marathon spawned a trilogy. It built Bungie a devoted Mac audience. It established them as the Mac's premier game developer. In 1997, they released Myth: The Fallen Lords, an isometric tactical strategy game that became their first major mainstream hit on both Mac and PC. Myth proved Bungie could make games for Windows. It proved they could compete with the bigger studios. It proved they were a real company. And then, in 1998, the wheels came off. Myth 2 shipped with a catastrophic bug. The game's installer, under certain conditions, would delete the entire contents of whatever directory the user installed it to. If you installed Myth 2 to your hard drive's root directory, you could potentially erase your entire computer. Bungie recalled all 200,000 copies. They printed and shipped replacement discs. The cost of the recall was estimated at $800,000, a catastrophic amount for a small independent studio. Bungie was effectively bankrupt. Enter Peter Tamt, brought in as Bungie's executive vice president to find money. He found it from 2 sources. First, Take-Two Interactive bought a 19.9% equity stake in the company. Second, Tamt reached out to Ed Fries, the head of Microsoft's gaming division, and started conversations about a deeper partnership. Microsoft was building a console. They needed launch titles. Bungie had something extraordinary in development, a real-time strategy game originally announced for the Mac, that they had been quietly transforming into a third-person shooter and then a first-person shooter. They called it Halo. The Halo demo Bungie showed at the 1999 Macworld Expo, with Steve Jobs personally announcing it on stage, made Mac gamers lose their minds. It was the most ambitious game ever shown for the platform. It was going to be Bungie's masterpiece. It was never going to ship for the Mac. On June 19th, 2000, the 9th anniversary of the company's founding, Microsoft announced that they had acquired Bungie. The Halo project, originally promised to Mac users, was now an Xbox exclusive. Steve Jobs reportedly called Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer and screamed at him. Microsoft had bought the premier Mac game developer and turned them into Xbox developers overnight. Apple felt betrayed. Mac gamers felt abandoned. Ed Fries had to personally appear on stage at Macworld New York to apologize and announce a deal where Microsoft would help port some games to the Mac as a peace offering. But the damage was done, and the result was Halo Combat Evolved, released as a launch title for the Xbox on November 15, 2001. Halo was the killer app the Xbox needed. The game critics called it the best first-person shooter on a console, period. The combat sandbox, where you balanced 2 weapons and grenades against the AI-driven swarms of Covenant, defined console FPS design for the next decade. The campaign, with its iconic music and its mysterious ring world setting, captured imaginations. The multiplayer, played at LAN parties on linked Xboxes, became a cultural phenomenon among teenagers and college students. Halo sold 5 million copies. The Xbox, propelled almost entirely by Halo's success, established Microsoft as a permanent player in the console business. Then came Halo 2 in 2004. Halo 2 sold 2.4 million copies on its first day, generating $125 million in 24 hours, a record at the time. Halo 2's multiplayer over Xbox Live transformed online console gaming. Players who had never used voice chat on a console were suddenly screaming at strangers across the country. The game's matchmaking system became the template every multiplayer console game would copy for the next 15 years. Halo 3 launched in September 2007 with the marketing tagline, "Finish the fight." It did $170 million on its first day. It was at the time the biggest entertainment launch in history, bigger than any movie, any album, any video game release that had come before. 6 days after Halo 3's launch, Bungie made an announcement that shocked the industry. They were leaving Microsoft. The cracks had been visible for years. The cultures never meshed. Bungie had always seen itself as a scrappy independent studio that happened to be inside a corporation. Microsoft saw Bungie as a critical asset that needed managing. After Halo 2, Bungie had begun renegotiating their profit share on Halo 3, demanding better terms. The negotiations were tense. The relationship was strained. So when Halo 3 shipped, Bungie cashed in their leverage. They negotiated their independence. Microsoft would retain ownership of the Halo intellectual property. Bungie would walk away as a privately held company once again, Bungie LLC. They would deliver 2 more Halo games under contract, Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach, and then they would be free. Microsoft created a new internal studio to take over Halo. They called it 343 Industries, named after the character 343 Guilty Spark from the original game. Bungie staffer Frank O'Connor left to join 343 as franchise director. The handoff was by all accounts professional. Halo Reach shipped in September 2010. It was Bungie's farewell to the franchise they had created. It was also, in the eyes of many fans, the last truly great Halo game ever made. Bungie was free. They had escaped the first corporate parent, and almost immediately, they signed a deal that would define, and nearly destroy, the next decade of their existence. In April 2010, 5 months before Halo Reach even shipped, Bungie announced a 10-year publishing partnership with Activision. The contract was not made public at the time. It would only become public 2 years later when, during the unrelated lawsuit between Activision and the founders of Infinity Ward, a Los Angeles judge ordered the contract unsealed. The Los Angeles Times published it in full, and what it revealed was extraordinary. Bungie had agreed to deliver 4 games over 10 years, with regular DLC and expansion content in between. The first game would launch in 2013. The schedule was punishing, annualized expansion releases with a new full game every few years. Bungie would receive between 20 and 35% of cumulative operating income from the franchise, depending on total earnings. There were performance bonuses if they hit sales targets. The franchise had a code name in the contract, Destiny. Destiny released on September 9, 2014. The hype was enormous. Bungie had spent over $140 million in development and another $360 million in marketing. The game shipped to mixed reviews. Critics praised the gunplay and the visuals, but were lukewarm on the thin story and the repetitive structure. The infamous moment where the antagonist's monologue was reduced to "I don't have time to explain why I don't have time to explain" became a meme that defined the launch. But despite the reviews, Destiny made money. Lots of money. The game sold 5 million copies in its first week and would eventually sell over 25 million across all expansions. The Taken King expansion in 2015 dramatically improved the game's quality and earned the praise that the base game had missed. Behind the scenes, the partnership with Activision was already failing. The annualized release schedule was killing Bungie's developers. The publisher's demand for constant new content meant the team was perpetually in crunch. Creative leads were leaving. The relationship was openly contentious. By 2017, Activision was publicly criticizing Bungie's performance on earnings calls. Destiny 2 launched in September 2017. It launched without much of the content from the original Destiny, including content players had paid for in expansions. The community revolted. The game's player count collapsed within months. Activision blamed Bungie. Bungie blamed Activision's release demands. The Forsaken expansion in September 2018 was Bungie's attempt to win the community back. It worked critically. Forsaken is widely considered the high point of Destiny 2's content, but it didn't sell well enough to satisfy Activision. In a November 2018 earnings call, Activision publicly expressed disappointment in Destiny 2's sales, a humiliation for Bungie. The breaking point had been reached. Bungie wanted out, and in late 2018 they secured an unusual lifeline, a $100 million minority investment from the Chinese tech giant NetEase. This gave Bungie the financial cushion they needed to make their move. On January 10, 2019, Bungie announced they were ending the Activision partnership 2 years early. Activision would transfer all publishing rights for Destiny back to Bungie. The Destiny intellectual property, which Bungie had retained ownership of throughout the contract, would now also be fully under their control. When Bungie executives announced the news to staff that afternoon, employees cheered, champagne was opened, people cried tears of joy. It was their second escape. They had broken free from Activision the way they had broken free from Microsoft. They were independent, they owned their franchise, they had a plan. For 3 years, that plan worked. The post-Activision era was Bungie at their best. Without the publisher pressure for annualized releases, Bungie restructured Destiny 2 around what they called the live service model. Quarterly seasons of smaller content, annual expansions, a 10-year narrative arc called the Light and Darkness Saga that would build toward an epic conclusion. Shadowkeep launched in October 2019, Beyond Light in November 2020. The Witch Queen in February 2022, widely considered the best expansion in the game's history. Each expansion improved on the last, the community grew, player counts climbed, Bungie was making more money per player than ever before, with full control over their roadmap and their story. The studio expanded, they started incubating new projects, they hired aggressively. By mid-2023, Bungie's headcount had reached approximately 1,600 employees, the largest the studio had ever been. Then, in January 2022, Sony Interactive Entertainment announced that they were acquiring Bungie for $3.6 billion. The deal was framed as something different from the Microsoft and Activision relationships. Bungie would remain an independent subsidiary. They would keep their leadership. They would continue self-publishing Destiny. They would have access to Sony's resources and infrastructure, but would not be absorbed into PlayStation Studios. Bungie would also reportedly help Sony build out its broader live service gaming ambitions, advising on other PlayStation projects. For Bungie staff and fans, the deal looked like the best of both worlds. The financial security of being part of a massive corporation, with the creative independence the studio had fought for over 2 decades. The final shape, the climactic expansion that would conclude the 10-year Light and Darkness saga, was scheduled for early 2024. The new IP, codenamed Marathon and now revealed as a sci-fi extraction shooter reviving Bungie's classic Marathon franchise from the 1990s, was scheduled to follow. The plan was solid, the team was bigger than ever, the financial backing was the strongest it had ever been, and then everything started falling apart. Destiny 2's Lightfall expansion, released in February 2023, was a critical and commercial disappointment. Sales fell 45% below Bungie's internal targets. The community reacted negatively to the expansion story, which felt like filler ahead of the planned finale. Player counts began declining. In October 2023, Bungie announced its first round of major layoffs, approximately 100 staff cut. The final shape was delayed from February 2024 to June 2024. Marathon was delayed from 2024 to 2025. The optimism evaporated. July 31st, 2024. Bungie CEO Pete Parsons announced the second round of layoffs in less than a year. 220 employees, roughly 17% of the studio's workforce, were terminated. Another 155 employees were transferred into Sony Interactive Entertainment, effectively absorbed into PlayStation Studios' infrastructure. An incubation team working on a project codenamed Gummy Bears was spun off to become its own PlayStation Studios developer. In a single announcement, Bungie's promised independence had ended. The studio that Sony had supposedly bought as an independent subsidiary was now being actively merged into Sony's broader operations. Employees who had cheered when Bungie escaped Activision in 2019 were now being absorbed into a corporate parent for the third time in their careers. The numbers told the story. Bungie's peak workforce of approximately 1,600 employees in mid-2023 had shrunk to approximately 850 by the end of 2024, a 47% reduction in 18 months. The final shape did launch successfully in June 2024. Critically, it was praised. The community largely felt it was a worthy conclusion to the 10-year story arc, but the financial damage was already done. The expansion's sales, while strong, couldn't reverse the player decline that had begun with Lightfall. Then came Sony's first major impairment loss. In November 2024, Sony recorded a $200 million write-down against Bungie's assets, citing Destiny 2's failure to meet expectations. The official Sony language was diplomatic. The level of sales and user engagement have not reached the expectations we had at the time of the acquisition, but the financial reality was brutal. Bungie's daily active player count for Destiny 2 had collapsed from a peak of 316,000 to approximately 15,000. The new Destiny 2 expansion that followed, The Final Shape, Episode 1, Echoes, then the start of a new saga called the Fate Saga, received mixed to negative responses from the community. Many longtime players felt The Final Shape had been the natural ending point. They didn't want a new saga, they wanted Destiny 3. Marathon, meanwhile, was in trouble. The closed alpha test in April 2025 was met with disappointment. Players and journalists who tested the game described it as derivative, citing similarities to other extraction shooters like Escape from Tarkov and The Cycle. The art style, while striking, drew controversy after independent artist Anti-Real accused Bungie of using her artwork without permission, a claim Bungie investigated and acknowledged, attributing it to a former employee. In June 2025, Bungie announced that Marathon was being delayed indefinitely. The game's original director, Christopher Barrett, had been removed in March 2024 following an internal misconduct investigation. His replacement, Joe Ziegler, a former director of Riot Games' Valorant, was now leading a project that had been redesigned multiple times. Reports described a development hell where the game had shifted from customizable characters to fixed heroes, from free-to-play to fixed price, with multiple changes to its core systems. Marathon finally launched on March 5th, 2026. The reviews were generally favorable. 74% of critics on OpenCritic recommended the game. The art direction was praised. The gunplay, as always with Bungie, was excellent. But the commercial performance was disappointing. The extraction shooter genre had become crowded. Marathon's player counts, while solid at launch, did not reach the heights Sony had been hoping for. 2 months later, Sony recorded the second impairment loss, $565 million. Combined with the earlier write-down, Sony had now reduced Bungie's value on their books by $765 million in less than 2 years. This is where Bungie sits in May 2026. A studio that was once 1,600 employees strong is now under 850. The publisher that bought them is publicly admitting they overpaid. Their flagship live service game has lost 95% of its peak player base. Their new IP, the one supposed to define their next decade, has launched to mixed commercial results. Industry analysts are openly speculating about what comes next. Wedbush Securities' Michael Pachter, who warned at the time of the original acquisition that Sony was vastly overpaying, has been vindicated. Some analysts are now describing Bungie as Sony's worst acquisition in PlayStation history. The internal restructuring has been brutal. Bungie has shifted resources internally. Marathon now has more developers assigned to it than Destiny 2, in an attempt to support the new game's live service operations. But that means Destiny 2, the franchise that Bungie spent a decade building, is being supported by a smaller team than at any point since 2017. Longtime Bungie veterans have left or been forced out. Destiny director Luke Smith and Mark Noseworthy, two of the most prominent creative leaders in the studio's history, quietly departed in 2024 after their spin-off project, codenamed Payback, was cancelled. Other senior creative figures have either been laid off or moved to Sony. The community sentiment has shifted dramatically. Once loyal Destiny players are openly discussing whether the franchise has a future. Longtime content creators who built their careers on Destiny coverage are pivoting away from the game. Reddit threads with thousands of upvotes ask whether Bungie will even exist in 5 years. Sony's leadership has continued to publicly back the studio. Their forecast for the upcoming fiscal year actually projects a revenue increase, which they attribute partly to the absence of further impairment losses on Bungie's assets. But that projection assumes things stabilize. It assumes Marathon retains players. It assumes Destiny 2 doesn't collapse further. It assumes no more bad news. For the first time in the studio's 35-year history, the question being asked is not whether Bungie will survive its current corporate parent. It's whether Bungie will survive at all. But there is one more card in the deck, one more project that, if it works, could change everything. In November 2025, a credible Destiny leaker named Colony Deeks posted on social media that Destiny 3 had entered extremely early development at Bungie. The leaker, who has a track record of accurate Bungie and Marathon reporting, noted that the project was so early they had hesitated to discuss it publicly. A second leaker, Cheetah Leaks, corroborated the report shortly after. Bungie has not officially confirmed Destiny 3. They have not announced it, they have not revealed it. The reporting comes entirely from leaks and industry rumor. But the signs are there. Bungie's recent decision to extend Destiny 2's roadmap discussions into 2026, citing the need for more time to lock in long-term plans, makes more sense if there's a sequel being planned in parallel. The departure of Luke Smith and Mark Noseworthy, who were working on the now-cancelled Payback spin-off, freed up senior leadership for new projects. The shift of resources away from Destiny 2 maintenance suggests something else is being built. According to the leaks, Destiny 3 is expected to be roughly 5 years from release. In gaming time, that's an eternity. It would put a hypothetical launch around 2029 or 2030, likely on PlayStation 6 hardware, likely as Bungie's defining project for the next generation of consoles. 5 years is also long enough that everything could change before it ships. Sony could lose patience and shut Bungie down. The Marathon player base could collapse and trigger another wave of layoffs. The Destiny community could lose faith and abandon the franchise entirely. The development team could be gutted further. The leadership could turn over again. Or, and this is the version Bungie is betting on, 5 years is enough time to make Destiny 3 the game that justifies everything. Long enough to address every complaint about Destiny 2's structure, long enough to learn from Marathon's launch and apply those lessons, long enough to design something that brings back the lapsed players who loved the Witch Queen and the final shape and felt the franchise had nothing left to offer them. Bungie has done this before. They survived the Myth 2 disaster that nearly bankrupted them in 1998. They survived the Microsoft acquisition that consumed their Halo dreams in 2000. They survived the Activision contract that ground their developers into burnout for 9 years. They survived the post-launch Destiny crisis that almost killed the franchise in 2014. They survived Destiny 2's disastrous launch in 2017 and rebuilt it into one of the most successful live service games of its generation. Every previous near-death experience for Bungie has been followed by a comeback, and every comeback has been driven by the same thing: the studio's ability to make games that, at their best, feel different from anything else in the industry. The gunplay that no other studio can quite match. The world building that draws players in for years. The community moments that become legend. Destiny 3 is the next test of whether that magic is still there, whether the studio that built Halo and Destiny still has another genre-defining game in them. Whether the Bungie that walked out of Microsoft in 2007, escaped Activision in 2019, and signed with Sony in 2022 can survive its own success and its own failures and its own corporate captivity for one more decade. The leaked reports are the only evidence. The studio is silent. Sony is writing down their balance sheet. The Destiny community is grieving. Marathon's future is uncertain. Pete Parsons is still CEO, but every quarter brings new questions about whether he'll stay. And somewhere, in the offices in Bellevue, Washington, a small team of developers, some of them veterans who built the original Destiny, some of them newer hires who joined after the Sony deal, are quietly building the game that will determine whether Bungie's next chapter is a resurrection or an ending. The hallway is dark. The phone might ring. We won't know for years. But Bungie has been here before. and every time before, they've found a way to keep running.